that the UK has dropped from, on the Transparency International Perceptions Indexes from 10th in the world to 20th in the world. There's a very big overlap between the top companies that provide hospitality to civil servants and ministers and the companies that actually get the most meetings. Britain's first ever political action committee. Now these are kind of creatures of the US. They were created as a result of these rules that allowed unlimited money to go into political campaigning outside of political parties. And the first one that has been set up is former Reform members and also a host of right-wing actors who want to influence UK elections.
Hello and welcome back to Democracy for Sale. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Sue Hawley, who's a very, very old friend of Democracy for Sale, if you can call it an old friend. Sue is Executive Director at Spotlight on Corruption, which is a really excellent NGO here in the UK that I really recommend checking out the work that they do. Spotlight on Corruption, as the name suggests, really, I think, more than almost anybody else, focus on ethics, integrity in British public life, in corruption as well, in malfeasance, in cronyism. And I think today what we're going to do is really talk about these issues. What do they mean in Britain? What does the landscape of Britain look like? What is the state of integrity in our politics? And especially, I think, overarching all this is we have a government that was elected about a year ago promising to clean up British politics. What have they done? And probably really importantly, what have they not done? And at the centre of today's discussion is something we've talked a lot about at Democracy for Sale, especially in recent weeks, the elections bill. This is a major piece of legislation which hopefully will have big implications for how political finance is regulated in the UK. Spotlight and Corruption, like us and others, have been raising significant concerns. We're going to really unpack what's in the bill, what's not in the bill, what does it mean for transparency and accountability, and kind of what does it say about the government's wider approach to ethics, lobbying, and particularly corruption in British politics. So, I guess if we're to sum it up, we're a year into Labour's time in office, and I think, has enough changed, or are we still seeing a lot of the old patterns there? Sue, welcome aboard. Absolutely lovely to have you.
So nice to be here, Peter. Very much looking forward to this discussion.
I think, Sue, let's dive straight in. We've written a lot about the elections bill. We've been working with 38 Degrees at Democracy for Sale, talking about a cap on political donations. But let's just start with the elections bill itself, with the proposals that came out a few weeks ago here. What's Spotlight's take on it? What did you think of the elections bill proposals?
Yeah, so, I think credit where credit's due. There's actually some genuinely good stuff in here. Stuff that, you've been banging on about for a while, Peter, stuff that we've been banging on about, greater transparency about unincorporated associations who donate, who, there's been real secrecy around, and it's been, a potential source for foreign influence and, really kind of secretive donations to
just to unpack that for a sec. For this, unincorporated associations effectively we've done a lot of reporting on this, as you say, and so have others, Democracy for Sale. But what effectively we're talking about are organisations that don't really necessarily have a corporate structure, don't have an address, don't file accounts, but are able to donate to British politics.
Exactly. So famously, in the Conservative Party case, we're talking about, the Carlton Club, which is like a political club. Maybe for Labour, we're talking more about organisations like Labour Together. So they played a really, really important part in political life and funding political parties. The other thing that we're very pleased about is that political parties are actually going to have to check where their donations come from. And, we got a football regulator that now has to do checks on where their owners' sources of wealth come from. Banks, estate agents, lawyers, accountants, they all have to do checks, even if, luxury car dealers, art dealers, but political parties didn't have to do any checks. And that was like a really major, major gap. And they're going to have to do checks to make sure that the donations they're getting actually do comply with the law. And unincorporated associations will also have to do those checks. So that's really, really good. It looks like there's going to be a crackdown on company donations. So, making sure that shell companies can't just be set up. And you literally could have someone set up a company in 15 minutes Companies House, no business activity in the UK at all, a secretive ownership trail leading offshore, giving money to a political party, and no one really knowing where that money is genuinely coming in. So that's good. Those are really good things. And the Electoral Commission is going to get more powers. And it's going to have really good stuff. It's finally going to also be regulating candidates, not just parties. Its fining powers have gone up from £20,000, which is absolute peanuts, given we're talking millions of pounds of donations, to 500,000. So this is all really good, and I think to be celebrated. What doesn't it do? And we've also been pretty vocal about that. And I think that probably the most shocking for us, and we were genuinely, quite surprised about this, was that it hasn't fully restored the Electoral Commission's independence. So a government can set a policy and strategy statement, basically, for the Electoral Commission. And that's actually really problematic, because the Electoral Commission, we've just had a great football victory, so I'm going to use a football analogy, but the Electoral Commission is like the referee for political parties. And this kind of statement is like giving the winner of the Premier League Cup the right to set the rules the referee polices. Like, we wouldn't accept that in football. We just can't accept that in politics, because it means that they could actually skew the rules in favour of a governing party.
And so just to pick that up as well, it's worth pointing out, I think, as well, that the Electoral Commission had been independent, and the previous elections bill in 2022, Boris Johnson, the then Tory leader, the Tories had floated, because they were very unhappy about prosecutions around Brexit, basically. They'd floated this idea of actually abolishing the Electoral Commission altogether. And then what they did instead was they made it, effectively, they took away its independence. And so really what we're talking about is actually just returning to the status quo for the last 20 years, except for the last few years. That's probably one of my criticisms too with the legislation, is in some ways it's unpicking what a particularly bad government did, rather than forward looking into what a good government could do.
Exactly. And thanks for clarifying that. But this was a relatively new power. So actually, Labour's decision to set its own policy statement will be the only the second time that's ever been done. And I think, we really have to question whether that is going to protect UK democracy from a future government that very well might want to do what you were saying the Conservatives actually wanted to do, which is really try and neuter the Electoral Commission. Because if you look at the playbook of autocratic governments, whether it's what's going on in the US now, what happened in Hungary, it's like getting control of the electoral body is one of the very early steps that these governments do, because they know that if they can set the rules of the electoral game, they can stay in power. So it should really, really concern all of us that the Electoral Commission is really robustly independent. And so I think that is probably, the key area. The other area that I know that you are very passionate about, and rightly so, is about it didn't do anything to limit the potential for multi-million-pound donations to completely skew the fortunes of a political party in the UK. And I think that's the key test. Like, would this prevent a foreign billionaire from donating to a party in a way that completely changes their electoral fortunes? And is that, do we want that as a democracy? And I think most people would say absolutely not. British elections need to be decided by British people. Another question is it going to protect UK elections also from foreign interference, Russia, China? And actually now we have to count the US in that. Like, we know that there will be a lot of attempts by the US, whether it's, the right-wing landscape of think tanks and media, or whether it's the, a Trump administration itself trying to influence our elections. So I think, what hopefully will get some momentum for is at least some kind of cap that prevents this kind of crazy multi-millionaire power, like no limit whatsoever situation with political parties. So I think there's a lot to fight for, actually. And I think, there's a lot of work for us all to be doing over the autumn, Peter.
I'm aware of that. No, that for sure, Sue. There's definitely a lot to be done. I think like one of the things I've used this stat a lot. Actually, I used it in the piece the other day. I think I use it in the words for the 38 Degrees' campaign on this. I can't believe there's research at Transparency International, our friends at TI did recently that found that um, two-thirds of private donations in 2023 into British politics have come from just 19 individuals, 19 people giving more than £1 million. And I think that's the thing that people often miss as well, is two bits. I think people are often surprised when they find out you can give unlimited amounts of money. And the second thing is we just have seen a big increase. We're doing some work on that at Democracy for Sale, which I think we'll probably publish in September. But just putting some bones on this as well, showing how we've seen this big increase. And there's much more of a capacity. And we've seen like the scale of donations. When I first started doing this work, £50,000 was a lot of money. Now you're talking about millions, you're talking about multi-millions, and there has been a big increase in the amount of money. And so it feels as if a small number of individuals are becoming more influential than almost ever before.
No, absolutely. And I think what you have to look at is, if you look at what's going on in the US at the moment, they're actually trying to overturn limits on donations to political parties. And I think this raises another key issue that it is a test of whether this elections bill is going to work. Because let's face it, this is like a once in a generation opportunity for us to get these rules right. But is actually, campaigners. So, we know in the US that the Citizens United judgment, which is very controversial, allows unlimited amounts of money in campaigning, but there are still actually limits on donations to political parties. And now, there's a whole legal action going to the Supreme Court, which JD Vance is behind, which is about getting those limits lifted. And we know that any, incoming government that is supportive or follows that right-wing agenda would do a very, very similar thing. So now is the time to make that harder, and actually have both some, serious discussion about caps, but also look at campaigning and who's behind campaigning. And so if we look at like an organization like Britain's first ever political action committee. Now these are kind of creatures of the US. They were created as a result of these rules that allowed unlimited money to go into political campaigning outside of political parties. And the first one that has been set up is by you know very well and have written about this, Peter, but former Reform members and also a host of right-wing actors who want to influence UK elections to make sure that very right-wing candidates are elected. And the real questions about, is this a body that actually needs to be regulated by the Electoral Commission? Does it have to be regulated at the moment? Or can it get away under the current rules with actually putting a lot of money into whether it's digital campaigning or advertising without being subject to very many rules? And I think that looking at that digital aspect of the bill and whether we got it right, have we given the Electoral Commission powers to actually get data off social media companies? Are digital imprints actually working, or do we need more active measures to counter actual misinformation? These are key things that are actually crucial to protecting our electoral integrity.
I was really struck as well by one aspect of that, which I feel like hasn't had much attention around the imprint stuff. Because in the proposals, there's what I hear time and again, actually what I see time and again, is that the rules are complicated and bad actors who don't care about the rules can just do what they want. And people who have good faith actually can easily get tripped up by the rules because they're quite complicated. And I feel like the proposals on digital imprints feel like a really good example of this. At the 2019 general election, I did a load of work looking at these groups that just appeared on Facebook buying huge amounts of Facebook ads, because one of the few places you could actually see this stuff was Facebook's transparency archive. They never accepted any donations, and it just disappeared. They're all these kind of third-party groups. And what you can see with the new proposed legislation, it says there's basically it's saying that anyone, that doesn't cover individuals, but any organization or group that is talking about politics online potentially could putting things in the public sphere could be regulated by the Electoral Commission, would have to put imprints on their material, which you could see in the wrong hands could quickly become quite a draconian measure that could have a chilling effect on public speech around politics. I was actually talking to somebody who runs a think tank, a proper think tank, not the kind of toughness think tank we write about, but a kind of policy focused international think tank. And they were saying, wow, what's it going to mean for me? Like, they'll often write a proposal that's about, what do the different parties present views on China? What do they mean? Well, in this context, that could easily quickly be interpreted, but by particularly as some form of involvement in politics. I do wonder. It feels to me like this is an area that needs a lot more thinking as well. I think that I have to say there's aspects of this that looks like how it feels that this government does policy, which is not really bring people that much into the tent, create it in house, and then here you go. And I don't know if you felt that, but I feel like there's areas there that potentially are problematic.
I think you've raised also a really key question, which is who is going to scrutinise any bill that's brought forward. There hasn't been any public consultation on any of these measures. I mean, that was a big criticism of the introducing a strategy and policy statement for the Electoral Commission. It's like there was no consultation on introducing this new power. And I think to have public credibility, there does need to be more public consultation. And I think you're absolutely right, Peter, because the thing about it's really hard to get the balance with this between, the free speech aspect. And that is the thing, if you look at what, J.D. Vance is saying in the spending limits case, is actually this is a limit to our free speech. So we know that the free speech will be used as a reason to try and get as much money into politics as possible. But we also know that, right-wing governments tend to repress free speech from voices that they don't like. So it's the irony or the contradiction is that you use free speech arguments or, even you use anti-corruption arguments to get you into power, but then you clamp down on free speech and behave in very corrupt ways. So I think you're absolutely right that this is not something that can be made on the hoof, and a lot of thinking needs to go into it, and how it's going to be regulated in a way that is fair and also possibly doesn't create really dangerous backlashes.
The one thing, and you mentioned as well, that we'll be very busy in the autumn. I'm really struck. I've been talking to some really senior politicians, really senior political figures. Some of whom are still active in politics. Some of whom are no longer, but are still involved on the margins, or are still interested. It does feel like this isn't the last word. There's going to be a lot done on this, especially I think when from September. Like, it felt like the government kind of just pushed it out towards the summer and was like, right, we're going to get away from this now. But it feels like it's actually going to be a really important battle on this.
I think so, and I think some of it will be quite a test of the mettle of new Labour MPs about how far they're prepared to push the government on it, and not just in our area like political finance, but lots of questions about proportional representation as a way to actually win back public trust, and that's got to be the key thing: is actually do these reforms build public trust in UK elections? That's the main test of whether they're going to work. So I think and as we see from the strategy, there are various areas where they're clearly still trying to work out the the detail on it, and they should be seeking input from people on that to make sure experts, campaigners, to make sure it's actually going to have credibility and not just be criticised as soon as it lands.
Yeah, because it also strikes me like the key thing, one huge part I think is foreign funding. Foreign funding is something people do not like. The public does not like it. Our electoral law is supposed to stop foreign funding of British politics. But you and I both know there's loads of ways for foreign money to get into the system. We're doing a story which will go out later this week. I won't reveal all the top lines of it, but we're looking at companies, because this, as it currently stands, this isn't going to change companies that are owned by foreign individuals from donation to British politics. So Elon Musk could still donate to British politics as much as he wants under terms of this. And we've been looking at other examples of this, where companies that are controlled, or the PSC, the person of significant control, is someone international who couldn't vote in Britain or is unlikely to be able to vote in Britain. How have they been able to, there are examples of them putting money into British politics, and there's a lot, frankly, there's a lot. And I think that's the kind of thing, it's all well and good having headlines like the government's already had about how we're going to stop this. As it currently stands, quite a bit of this bill isn't going to do that.
I absolutely agree, and I think I mentioned that's got to be the test. Would it stop a foreign bill?
Yeah.
From an Indonesian? And you're absolutely right, it wouldn't. because the rules in relation to companies are just not robust enough. So we put out a piece actually before the announcement by the former chair of the Electoral Commission, Bob Posner, who's saying you should make sure that the ultimate beneficial owner of the parent company is a permissible donor. I think that is still being worked out. Like, what are the real permissibility checks? Should you actually ban corporate donations altogether, like happens in Canada? You know, that would be very simple way of getting around it, because whenever you create rules, there will be, further ways around it. So do you also ban, companies that have ownership via offshore structures that, obscure their ownership from making donations? And I think that's an area, because it does seem like there's a chink where there is more work being done on. I think it's really excellent that if you're showing examples whereby this just won't go far enough. It definitely wouldn't have stopped a Musk donation, because he could have used his UK subsidiaries to make a donation, and just having this income test is not going to be enough, frankly.
And of course, if he was to use that outside an election period, outside of the 12 months regulated election period, the donation would be declared, but how it was spent would be completely invisible.
Exactly. And that is another area that we've been trying to raise the temperature on, which is, there's quite widespread recognition that we are in an era of permanent campaigning. We know that. Why should it only be in a regulated period that we know, how parties are spending money to influence our vote? And the danger of that is that they do a lot of work and put a lot of money into stuff up until the regulated period. So we get a very distorted sense of, how they're spending in the run-up to an election. So I think, actually having annual reporting, which would also include proper reporting about digital spending that happens for their benefit, would also be really, really important. That is a harder lift. I think we need, any listeners listening who want to come and brainstorm some really brilliant ways to do that and work out the technicalities of it, then we would love to be in touch with them, as I'm sure you would too, Peter.
Very much. If anyone wants to get in touch, please do it. I would pass you on to Sue or chat to you myself. Sue, thank this one. It's really interesting. This is, I think we've all got a lot to do. I think it's fair to say, including, I'm really watching this on this issue. I think in months in particular, I think from September on will be a really big key moment for this. I guess wanted to zoom out a little bit, because one of the things that first caught my eye with Spotlight is your name, Spotlight on Corruption. It really is doing what it says on the tin. Like, how would you, looking around Britain now, looking around British politics, British public life, corporate life as well, what does corruption look like in Britain in 2025?
Ooh, just a small question then.
My apologies.
No, it's a great question. I mean, look, I think traditionally British people like to think of themselves as completely uncorruptible and full of integrity. And, we compare ourselves to Nigeria or Italy, and we're like, we're not like that. But I think, there's a real mismatch now, because actually we know that perceptions of corruption in England are very, very high. We know that the UK has dropped from on the Transparency International Perceptions Indexes from 10th in the world to 20th in the world. And that's just really, I think, a reflection of people's sense of what's going on in Britain. And, time and again, you have the indicators of how people feel about politics and how they feel about government. The polls show that people feel that Britain is getting more corrupt, that a lot of politicians are corrupt. And all political parties and donations are dodgy and corrupt. So I think it's just like there are various things going on. One of them is we actually literally don't know how corrupt Britain is, because there is no central reporting line for people who've got corruption allegations. We've only just recently set up a new domestic corruption unit, the City of London Police. Corruption is real corruption is very secretive. very hard to measure. It's not like fraud where you can show this money's gone out my bank account, But the flip side of that is that people can end up seeing everything as corruption. And I think, there's some quite interesting research being done recently by some of the LSE that, corruption becomes a shorthand for people feeling locked out of the system, that they feel, you know, they don't get any say, therefore it must all be corrupt. And you see that, at a local level with planning decisions, right? Everyone feels that planning decisions are inherently corrupt. There are a lot of corruption in planning decisions, but not every planning decision that we don't like or makes us feel excluded is corrupt. So it's quite a hard thing to talk about, actually, because the other thing that's going on here is something I mentioned earlier, which is, the more we talk about, corruption, the more we can make people feel even more disenchanted with government and with politicians. But on the other hand, we can't let politicians off the hook. So you get into a dilemma about what are the ways, and there's some really interesting thinking starting to come out about that. Like what is the language we need to use about corruption? That it needs to be more empowering, actually, about, we can do something about this. We do need politicians to listen to people, giving good examples where politicians actually have, because the bottom line is, we're actually at a really quite dangerous moment with democracy in terms of just how low trust is in politicians. And even just over the last few years, you've kind of seen the stats that have come out from, places like the OECD that are measuring people's sense of political public integrity. They're just really tanking. So we need to find a way of talking about it that actually helps restore people's trust in politics, but also doesn't cede the ground to, right-wing narratives around how, the elite have got power, they're all corrupt. I mean, we see that if you look at Reform's manifesto, it promises a Westminster anti-corruption, unit. If you look at some of the language about local government, it's all wasteful and corrupt, therefore we need to go in and cut it. So we have to find a way to challenge that narrative, and show actually you need strong rules, you need independent regulation that really works to help stop corruption. It's not about just cutting all public funding and cutting government. We need some really good narratives that show how to genuinely combat corruption that also make people feel empowered.
It's really interesting. As someone, I used to work for an organization called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and I think there's something in that narrative. There's two bits of this I think are fascinating. The first is, there's lots of other bits of it. The two things that strike me, Sue, is that one is that, as you said, actually, if you go to certain countries in the world, the word corruption has been completely and utterly co-opted, often by the people in power. We actually saw recently probably the most significant protests against Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine were in recent weeks over his proposals to essentially take the anti-corruption body under executive power, so basically to neuter it. We've seen in countries people using anti-corruption legislation to arrest their enemies. We've seen this. It has. I think it's not just a rhetorical problem. I think you're completely correct here. It's something that is actually getting to the nub of how do you use these powers, because actually they're being abused in places, and some of these accusations are not just real. They're real. This is a real problem.
Yeah, the weaponization of corruption is very real, and as you say, like in the wrong hands. If you look at what's happening in Turkey and Erdogan's arrests of the mayor, it's all on corruption. If you look at the charges against Navalny by Putin, they were on corruption. So there is this weaponization of corruption that is very real and very problematic. And I think it does mean we have a real responsibility in the anti-corruption movement to think about how we use language about corruption that is empowering, but also how we highlight, corruption is real, and there are really important ways to deal with it, which, as I said, include having really independent anti-corruption investigative units like the one in Ukraine, not dismantling them.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that strikes me as well is an issue I think happens to a lot of people in our space, journalists, campaigners, people who care about these issues. By highlighting it, how much do you feed into that narrative? I think it's something that I think a lot of people, I talk to journalists about this all the time, you know, like, are you feeding into a narrative that actually is, everyone's all the same, they're all in it for themselves? I think, which is something I think most of us actually, from our experience of dealing with people, find that, and you can actually see it, like corruption in politics is a pretty cross, it does cross a lot of party lines. Corruption in public life, similarly. Like, I think it's very easy to get political narratives around these things that don't really reflect what's going on. But yeah, there's an element in which I think a lot of us privately in our kind of innermost thoughts go, am I the baddie?
I think we all have a responsibility, actually, to think that. And I know there are kind of some academics who think that it has all our anti-corruption rhetoric, actually, and work over the last 10 years actually been feeding distrust in politics. Um, so I think it is a moment where we need to look at how do we use the language about corruption. Actually, should we rename ourselves Spotlight on Integrity, for instance, or kind of, because people just say, they're all bad, and actually, the more you say all politicians are corrupt and they're all bad, the less people want to go into politics who are really good and have a lot of integrity. Because why would you be so brave and foolish enough to spend, 22 hours of your waking life doing a job that you then get slated for? So I think, we really, it's really important that probably, it sounds really a bit naff and it's really hard to pull off, but highlighting really good examples where it's really worked and makes people feel empowered. So I think, like, th- there's a lot of discussion about how do we meet the public's appetite here, because actually what the public want is they do want robust action on corruption. They do really care about it. They want independent regulators of particular politicians. They want politicians to live by the same rules as they feel everyone else has to. And they want more of a say in government decision making. And if you look at all of those, they all relate to really important parts of the anti-corruption agenda, which is, stopping unfair lobbying by particular firms capturing government policy, having more equal access to decision makers. They're actually using citizens' assemblies to get far greater participation. So, for instance, what could be more important than our elections, or artificial intelligence and how it's going to affect us all? How do you actually genuinely make citizens who feel really left out of the debate feel that they've got a say in actually how government policy is being set?
And kind of, I guess this kind of leads on to like a kind of much more concrete question around this. But Labour's just recently talked about creating an Ethics and Integrity Commission. We've had this thing called ACABA, which is a word that we know a lot, most people don't. Thankfully, we won't need to know it again for any time soon. The Advisory Commission on Business Appointments, which is, beyond toothless, the regulator for what we call the revolving door between senior civil servants and ministers in the public sector. So basically, if you went and got a job with a nice, often a nice sinecure job somewhere as an advisor to somebody after you'd left office, ACABA would basically write to you and say, you mustn't lobby the government or use any of your influence, but if you do, there's nothing we can do about it. So the idea is this is going to have more teeth. What's your take on this? Is this meaningful reform, or is this just another name, another kind of alphabet soup? And is this the kind of level of thing we're talking about here with a kind of proper anti-corruption body?
Yeah, it's a really. I think there are two things, because originally the idea was that there would be this big new Ethics and Integrity Commission that would be truly independent, properly police politicians, a little bit like you've just had in Australia. The Australian Labor government have just created this new National Anti-Corruption Commission. It was very, very popular in Australia. It's got a lot of teeth. So there was that sense that we have this kind of good chap system in Britain, and we saw the good chap system really, really creak under the strain of Boris Johnson, which is that if you have someone who doesn't care about the rules, there's no real mechanism to force them to obey, then they're just going to carry on and ignore the rules, which exacerbates this sense that people feel that politicians actually don't live by the same rules as the rest of us. So, I mean, I think this Ethics and Integrity Commission was a really important piece of the Labour's manifesto, and it fitted with what Keir Starmer talked about, which was that actually the fight for trust in government and politics is the battle of our era, and I think there was a big potential here for the Labour government to step up with some really ambitious reforms to meet the appetite that we've been talking about, that the public want, proper independent regulation. And so what they've done isn't, in terms of the commission, it's not bad, but it's a bit of a nothing burger, really, unfortunately. I mean, it's good that they're going to, have one body that coordinates more. It's basically a bit of a revamp and relaunch of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which is a very good body, but, it puts forward recommendations that, have no legal standing or no bite. The government said it'll listen to them a bit more. It's fine as far as it goes, but this is a situation where trust is so low that if you really want to prove that we are going to restore trust in politics and politicians here, we need something a bit more. And I think everyone across the field, whether it's constitutional experts or the Institute for Government, the response has been a bit the same, which is like, at least give these regulators statutory protection. So it kind of moves us on to the the revolving door rules, and they were so toothless because they had no teeth. But currently, the new rules also have no teeth. They're going to be, instead of having a chair with someone loud and vociferous like Lord Pickles saying, "This is terrible, tut tut," but isn't it shocking that all I can do is tell you how terrible this is and tut tut? You're going to have the independent advisor, who is a prime ministerial appointment, actually overseeing the revolving door rules for ministers, and then the Civil Service Commission doing it for civil servants. So you basically fragmenting rules are still only advisory. And so I think it's actually really problematic. I think what everyone wanted was them to take a cobra and actually make it stronger and give it teeth. And instead you're getting a fragmentation of the rules. And I think you will possibly get less transparency. We might get less robustness. At least, journalists like you had something to go on when they had, one of Pickles' letters, cross letters.
So they're very useful, actually. Eric Pickles would write these like, "I'm sorry, this is terrible, but there's nothing I can do about it." But they were very helpful.
Yeah.
And Pickles himself was actually quite a helpful character to talk to on this stuff.
Yeah.
Because he actually, he would constantly come out and tell you how toothless I think he ran was. And I think that's part of the issue for someone like me. I can see exactly this fragmentation. And it brings us on to an issue I think a lot of people have a problem with and don't realise, a bit like political relations, just how bad the system is, which is lobbying. It's related to this, but it's hard to understate, I think, how appalling Britain's lobbying laws are. We are talking about a situation. Transparency International suggests that about 4% of lobbying is captured by the lobbying register. There's all manner of exemptions. There's exemptions if you're an in-house lobbyist, you don't have to register. You only have to register if you're directly lobbying ministers or senior civil servants. Unintentional lobbying doesn't count if you meet them at a drinks party. That doesn't have to be registered. There's an insane VAT, and I say insane intentionally, VAT exemption, which actually is an investigation into global counsel Peter Mandelson's firm, sparked by one of our stories a while ago, and Sue, you did great work on the Spotlight, where we found that effectively they had been lobbying on behalf of an arm of the Qatari government. We had all the evidence, but because the lobbying was done by the Middle Eastern branch, the UAE branch of Global Council, that wasn't based in the UK, so surprise, surprise, wasn't VAT registered, so it didn't have to register. So that wasn't a breach of the lobbying laws. The lobbying laws basically mean that any foreign lobbying can't be in breach of the lobbying laws if it's not declared because it doesn't pay VAT. It's just, it's really is mad. I think is the only way to describe it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's this is something that we really need the government to actually come forward with some proposals, because what we're concerned about at the moment is that they're actually possibly go backwards. So the last government, there are two ways you can find out about who's being lobbying. You've got the lobbying register, as you've said, which is absolutely, covers a minuscule amount of lobbying that actually takes place and is full of absurd holes. And then you've got what the government is meant to release about who ministers and senior civil servants have been meeting. And there was a recommendation from the Committees on Standards of Public Life that this should be released in a timely manner. Otherwise, we find out, a year later, who's actually been meeting with the government about a government policy. So the rules that those departmental transparency releases also need to be really robust, timely, accurate, and cover actually what the meetings were about, not just like meeting, which is what some of the descriptions are. And so much so that organizations like and journalists like yourself, Peter, have to basically do freedom of information requests to find out what big corporations have been saying to government about how they should be conducting policy. And that can't be right. We all have a right to know who is influencing government policy. So I think the transparency of lobbying is shocking and abysmal, and sadly that like Labour were actually rowing back from a commitment that was made under the Sunak government to actually have a central database with monthly releases of who's been meeting. And we need them to know who's meeting special advisors. Special advisors are incredibly powerful across government. They are the kind of ministerial mouthpiece who liaise with the civil servant. They really matter. It's absolutely crazy that we don't know who's meeting special advisors. And they need to cover informal communications like WhatsApp and, as you said, meeting at parties. So we really need a lot more transparency in how government policy is being made and who is meeting with who. And we did a big report on this, levelling the playing field. And we cross-checked the lobbying data with hospitality data across 5 different departments. And what we found was that there's a very big overlap between the top companies that provide hospitality to civil servants and ministers and the companies that actually get the most meetings. And we found it like enormous disparity between the amount of meetings that, companies get, particularly big companies that are relevant to that department's policy, and what public interest groups get. So, we think it's not just about transparency, it's also got to be about fairness. And I'm not kind of advocating for us to get more access, although it would be nice, but it's got to make people in Britain feel like they have a stake and a say in government decision making, and that it is being done in the public interest, a public interest that they can recognise, which comes back to artificial intelligence, which I know you've done some brilliant work on, the lobbying, who's actually getting in to set the policy of the government's AI advisor. And I think it's particularly important because one of the things I meant to mention in relation to the revolving door, Peter, is that this government is also actually wanting to increase or speed up the revolving door between the private sector and government. It wants more private sector people to come into government. Governments for the last 15 years have been saying that, possibly longer. But if you're going to do that, you've got to manage the conflicts of interest and you've got to manage the dangers of policy capture. And we know from the National Audit Office that conflicts of interest are absolutely hopelessly managed within government. You've got literally no follow-up to conflicts of interest declarations, no one making sure that people are actually abiding by rules to prevent conflicts of interest happening. So we've actually got, like some quite serious problems that are going to be massively exacerbated if the government is serious about just bringing more and more business people into government. So we need to know also about secondments, who's being seconded into departments from businesses, but we've got to have these mechanisms that are about fairer access. And that was what came out of the Greensill inquiry. Nigel Boardman said, you have to have a mechanism for those who would otherwise not have a voice to have a say in, government decision making. And public consultations are also completely captured by the small number of businesses who have captured government policy in their various departments. So if we really want to restore if the government really wants to restore trust in politics and in government and in politicians, we've got to tackle this, and it's got to be a dual strategy of more transparency, but also far more creative thinking about more active participation in decision making.
Yeah, I think that's a really thanks, Sue. I think that piece of the level of playing field was a great report. I was going to mention actually. It really, what it shines a light on, and we did a lot of stories recently about the amount of meetings, say, between Peter Kyle, the tech secretary, and big tech, and people are like, well, yeah, but like, what does that matter? So he meets everybody. And it's like, no, the thing is actually really he doesn't. He's really just meeting these small number of companies. And like, you're 23 times more likely to have had a meeting with a government minister if they take 23 times more meetings with big businesses than public interest groups. I think that's a huge issue. I think it's really, really important. I guess the thing I kind of find myself wondering, so I find this in a lot of the work that we do, like, why is Labour not being more active on this? Like, it feels like a space where you could, this feels like a space where you could create a narrative about tackling the vested interest. You could create a narrative about taking money out of politics. You could create a narrative around lobbying and influence. You could do all of those things pretty cheaply as well. Like, what's happening? And actually, very senior Labour people ask me this. Many of them no longer in government. People who've been very senior in government ask me this, and I struggle to give a really coherent answer. But what's your take?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is no doubt it's very disappointing, and I think there are lots of different political calculations going on. We know that, actually the Freebiegate affair very early on in the Starmer government.
These are the gifts from Labour donor Lord Ali, like the suits and sunglasses, everything else to Keir Starmer, in which Keir Starmer reacted to the immortal line, "All MPs get gifts," which was just like, this is, I must confess, I found that very dispiriting. I don't think I was probably the only one about this time last year.
I think it was very dispiriting, but it was also like it was so damaging early on to a government that was coming in to say we're doing things differently, to behave exactly how the public expect politicians to behave, which is, take lots of gifts, get lots of benefits, and then claim it's all within the rules. So I think, unfortunately, that may have had, a bit of a dampening appetite, the sense that this was all now a bit too politically difficult. I think the other thing is that, I think there is possibly a genuine sense of like, well, we're in power now, we're the good guys. I don't get it because it seems to be a very dismissive attitude to what is so obviously out there as a palpable feeling about that needs to be addressed. But, you can't just rely on, we're new, we're Labour now. We don't do that because that's not how the public feel. So I think, it's just not seen as a politically salient issue that is going to get people out of bed in the morning. A new Ethics and Integrity Commission isn't going to cut it. But I think that ignores that this is like the wallpaper behind politicians. This sense of whether they've got integrity and ethics. It actually shapes how people feel about their politicians. It might not be the issue that comes to mind when they're talking about it, but it shapes how they feel. So it's very, very dangerous to ignore it. And I think we're seeing, the deep unpopularity of the government is partly due to their not meeting those public expectations about governing in a different way. And I think a kind of sense like we've just got to deliver, and talking about these long-term projects, which don't make people feel on a day-to-day level that, anything different is happening, and that, there really is a new bunch of people in power.
I'll bring it to a close, but just I can't resist the temptation to mention the wallpaper. It is worth remembering that a very prominent Conservative donor, Lord Brownlow, once paid for Boris Johnson's wallpaper. So not only is ethics something, it is. I agree with you that it's something that maybe sometimes feeds it, but actually in recent British memory, we've seen literal cronyism involve big wallpaper. So if nothing else, that should focus to mind. So just as we come to the end, like if you had a kind of wish list, in terms of this, in terms of a policy wish list, what would it look like?
So, I mean, we've talked about some of it. Let's get a really ambitious electoral bill that really would prevent Musk from, actually it could be a really far right Tommy Robertson party that he funds. It could really distort UK politics. Let's get lobbying transparency sorted, and let's have proper guidance and equal access policy, and ramp up citizens' participation in decision making. Actually, the Ethics and Integrity Commission, we need statutory independent regulators. And this is the other thing, Peter, when you said what's going on, is there seemed to be some idea that somehow independent regulation is bad and it's anti-growth. And there's been a really damaging attack by the government on independent regulators, and this buying into a narrative, which is actually the narrative that Trump is peddling, which is, the government is somehow embodies the will of the people, therefore it should not, have independent regulators getting in their way. And that's a very, very dangerous narrative that is actually paving the way for potentially some very autocratic future government. So I think the obsession with growth and everything must be sacrificed on the altar to growth, including independent regulation and regulators, is also part of the issue that is stopping this agenda getting further traction and more ambition from government.
And just finally, I always like to try and end on an optimistic note. Like, see, what can we do? What can civil society do? What can journalists? What can people just watching this or listening to this do? What can we do to drive change from the outside, do you think?
I genuinely feel that people need to make their voice heard and tell government that this matters, because they have to hear it from as many different people as possible. And particularly, I think, harass your MP, actually write to, a minister like Pat McFadden saying how important it is that they really restore trust and get proper independent regulation of politicians. These things, if enough people do it, they start to make people feel like, actually we got to do something about this. It often feels really disempowering, but I think we just have to keep going because we've got a lot of really great solutions, and we've got incredible allies like at Democracy for Sale, all the stuff you expose and the investigations you do. We've got to persevere because the stakes are too high. This really is actually about whether the UK goes the route of America or whether we can claw back, a sense of Britain that is based on really deep democratic values with, a political and government service that is based in integrity.
Sue, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. Yeah, I must say, Spotlight Corruption do fantastic work. Follow them on social media, look up, read what they do, support them. Absolutely brilliant. But thank you so much, Sue, for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.